All right. Well, we can get started here. For anyone who I haven't yet met, my name is Courtney Northrup. I'm the education programmer with BC and PHA. I'm going to be on the call today, just kind of in the background, helping with questions or any sort of tech support. Um, so if you have any issues with connectivity at all, you can type it in the chat, wave aggressively on the camera, get my attention in any way, and we will do our very best to help. But otherwise, I will pass it over to Jessica, who will be leading us through the first part of the session this morning.
Thank you very much, Courtney. I am going to share my screen and then we can go from there. Okay, so I hope you all are sort of looking at my screen now. Just a good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Jessica. I'm a Senior Strategic Advisor for Sustainability and Resilience at BC Housing. And today is the first session in the BC Nonprofit Housing Climate and Disaster Resilience webinar series. The aim of the series is sort of to provide a practical introduction to climate and disaster risk in a housing context. We know that organizations are at different stages in this work, so some may already be undertaking risk assessments or resilience planning. Others are sort of just starting to think about what climate risks mean, sort of operationally for buildings, for tenants. And the intention is not to sort of make everyone technical experts, but to build a shared understanding of how these risks can show up across housing portfolios and sort of some practical starting points for responding to them. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge that at BC Housing, we work on the traditional and unceded territories of hundreds of Indigenous peoples throughout the province. I'm grateful to be joining you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the collaboration behind this webinar series. It's been a joint effort between BCN PHA, AMA, BC Housing, and the province of BC. I want to thank everyone on the screen who's sort of helped shape the series, and we've got a lot more folk coming in as we go along. There's a huge amount of expertise across this group, and we're very pleased to sort of be bringing people together to share knowledge and tools and practical approaches to climate and disaster resilience. So I think everyone here is already very aware that climate and disaster impacts are increasing across BC. A lot of these headlines are sort of no longer hypothetical or future risks. They're really becoming part of the operational environment that housing providers are already managing. And the question is really increasingly less, is this happening? And more, how do we start now planning and building resilience in practical ways, which this webinar series is very much starting to explore. So the purpose of the series is really threefold. The first is to build awareness of emerging climate and disaster risks across BC and what they might mean for housing providers. The second is to share practical approaches across preparedness and resilience and planning, recognizing that organizations are at relatively different stages here. And the third is to connect providers to tools, to resources, to expertise, and to sort of each other. I think this work is evolving, and we certainly don't have all the answers, but we hope this series can sort of help supporting practical steps across the sector. Here's a topic overview of the webinar series. Today's session is really sort of the broad, provincial overview. We'll get an introduction of the BC disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment work, some of the provincial tools and data sets available, and what this can mean for housing providers. And then, sort of over the coming months, the series will go deeper into sort of practical topics like heat preparedness and wildfire smoke and resilient neighborhoods and so on. So, just briefly on the agenda for today. sort of moved through the overview of the series. We'll now hear from the province on the broader disaster, climate risk, and resilience assessment work and the local government requirements under EDMA. I'll then walk through some sort of practical housing focused starting points and some tools and sort of approaches that can be used. And we'll leave a good half hour at the end for discussion and questions and so on. So to provide us with a overview of the DCRA, I'm very pleased to hand over and introduce to Melissa, who is a senior policy analyst for disaster risk assessment from the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And it's really nice to be with you all this morning. I'm going to get my screen shared here. And while that's happening, I'll share that I'm really pleased to be calling in this morning from Lekwungen territory, where I live close to downtown Victoria. And it's a beautiful day here today, blue sky. Though it might be hot, and that certainly makes me think about disaster and climate risks. Does that look okay to folks? Okay,
yes,
great.
Looks good. Yeah.
Awesome. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this assessment that we concluded last year, the Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment. The assessment took place across the province of BC. So like Jessica, acknowledging a lot of different territories and Indigenous peoples when we did this work. This work was a bit of a matrix, and I think this is indicative of just how many different people and different types of expertise it takes to do a really comprehensive understanding of disaster and climate risk. And I say that not to scare people, but just to say that, I think that there are sometimes unexpected places where expertise related to this topic can come from. So just kind of taking a step back a little bit to think a little bit about where this work came from. The actual disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment started in 2023, but the work certainly goes much further back. It was in 1997 that the province first did a province-wide hazard risk and vulnerability assessment, which is one type of risk assessment. And then that was built on by a number of different hazard events that we had until we got the mandate commitment to specifically do this project. So it's really informed by, as Jessica said, all of these different events that are really becoming not theoretical, but very real across the province of BC. And recognizing that there's a need to, number one, understand the risk much better, and then number two, think about what that means for how we prepare across all sectors in the province. And then this specific project was concluded last year, in 2025, and I'll get into a little bit about what's coming next. So as I mentioned, this specific assessment came out of a mandate commitment, and I'll point attention to the guiding pillars for this work, because I think that helps to lay the context a little bit. So we were aiming to, number one, collaborate with First Nations through this project. Number two, take an equity-informed, strengths-based approach, so thinking not just about risk, but also about resilience and where our strengths lie. Number three, to include the best available knowledge of any kind. And then number four, to try and tailor the work to support communities. So to develop tools and resources that would be helpful for communities taking on their own risk and resilience work. And I'll go through what tools we have out of this. So the scope and scale of the DCRA, it's a multi-hazard holistic risk and resilience assessment. It was based on both existing and new information. We brought in experts, a lot of different partners, and we also included a scenario analysis as part of our risk assessment. And then, as mentioned, it pulled on a wide range of knowledge sources, qualitative, quantitative, Western and Indigenous knowledge and science, and local level information, as well as the provincial context. So what it does is it lays a baseline of information and a foundation for future work, and is intended to be built on. It builds a body of information that we feel is reliable and consistent. And from the perspective of trying to support communities, everything is publicly available. And that was a big priority of the work, and why in some cases you might be familiar with a data set or a hazard layer that might, for example, be more detailed, but if it wasn't available to the public, then we couldn't use it. And then in terms of coverage, it includes the whole province of BC. And so it would be what we call a wide and shallow assessment, as opposed to being narrow and deep. For example, an assessment that looks at a very specific hazard in a very specific location can drill down to a really specific level. This is intended to give us broad insights across the province. So therefore, what it does not do, it doesn't replace a local risk assessment where you might have a specific objective. You might be looking at very specific risks in your geographic area. It also doesn't provide data that's suitable for a very detailed parcel level analysis, again, because it's intended to give broader insights. Can be used as a bit of a screening tool, and we'll get into that a little bit more for how to actually do that with this work. But that's not the intention for the data. And then it didn't identify all hazards across the whole province. It looked at a specific subset of hazards, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. So the DCRA was guided by the question, how do hazards impact what we value? Recognizing that risk and resilience assessments are at their core a little bit of a values-based question. We care that something is at risk because we care about something. So we assessed 6 hazards in the context of what we called value areas. So the 6 hazards you'll see on the screen here. So we looked at 2 types of flood, extreme heat, drought and water scarcity, wildfire, and earthquake. We also looked at a multi-hazard scenario. And then we assessed those hazards in the context of these value areas. So we have the built environment, the natural environment, governance, the economy, health and well-being, and society, cultures, and relationality. So really intending to think about what do we care about, and dividing them into these value areas as a way to do a little bit of a systematic assessment. Of course, these value areas, you can't actually, in reality, clump them into these nice little buckets. They cross over, they feed into each other, but this was a way to set up an assessment in a systematic way. So this is the framework for the DCRA, and how the results are structured. So again, it was a values-based assessment. So again, thinking about those hazards in the context of what we value, what we care about. We looked at each individual hazard and the risk and resilience insights for each hazard. We then looked at each of those value areas and risk and resilience insights for each of the value areas. We used event scenarios, 1 per hazard, to communicate a story about the hazards and their impacts on those value areas again. We looked at the influence of climate change on all of these disaster events, and so integrated climate change's influence onto risk and resilience. We included a quantitative analysis, a geospatial look at trends across the province. And then we also considered disproportionate impacts of all of the hazards on certain groups. And then all of this was done in collaboration with a First Nations committee. So both they gave input on the process as well as the results and the tools. And then just talking a little bit about how we actually did this work. So this work was led by my ministry in collaboration with the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions, at the time, the Climate Action Secretariat. Again, all the work fed up through this First Nations committee. And then we had two teams, one specifically looking at the geospatial analysis and one advising on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then we had working groups for each hazard and for each value, which were comprised of subject matter experts, local government representatives, First Nations and Indigenous organizations, all levels of government, lots of different experts sat on these working groups. And so they were able to identify key information and then also their expert judgment on the different hazards, how they interact with the different value areas, and then also thinking about that extreme event scenario as well. Each of these working groups identified risk statements as a way to assess the risk across the province, and then they also developed what they called resilience statements or objectives, as in what does a resilient future look like for a given hazard or a given value area, kind of like the North Star that they might be working towards when we think about building resilience. So in terms of things that came out of the DCRA, I like to think of them sort of into these three categories. So the methodology from the DCRA, which includes qualitative and quantitative approaches that we used for the work. Those are pieces that can be taken and transferred to other types of work. A good example is that for thinking about climate considerations, we use global warming levels, and there's lots of information about this in the report itself. We spent quite a lot of time building a context for the work to happen within, so developing definitions and key guiding concepts for this project, many of which we'll continue to use in future work for the province. And then last, data, science, and knowledge. So this includes existing information and new information and data, and a few related products, which I'll walk through some of them. So for example, the First Nations committee that we worked with developed First Nations definitions and understandings of all the hazards and values. We have an updated climate overview for the province of BC. And so we hope that these resources will be used as a reference and a building block for lots of other work, and could perhaps be a starting point if you're starting to think about risk and resilience in your own context. I'm going to touch just really briefly on some of the findings from the DCRA, both for interest and also just to give you some sense of the type of information that you can find in the report, and maybe some good things for us all to be aware of. So starting in the top left here, across the province, climate model projections point to increasing frequency and severity of all climate-related risks. And I'm sure that you all have experienced these impacts directly. To the right, floods are among the most common and costliest hazards in BC, with impacts to the built environment, economy, and food security. For earthquake, we looked at a scenario that was a magnitude 9 earthquake. And through the scenario that we looked at, that's projected to have damages of around 128 billion. That doesn't include other hazards an earthquake might trigger, such as tsunami. And this is also quite a conservative estimate, to be honest. So I would expect that by now, the number would likely be much higher. And then just a brief insight from the work that was done on extreme heat with a global warming level of 4 degrees. The likelihood of a 3-day extreme heat event becomes almost certain. And this is based on analysis from PCIC, our BC climate data organization. And then I just thought I'd just share a little bit about the multi-hazard scenario that we looked at. So as I'm sure you're all aware, and we're seeing this now already this summer, many combinations of hazards can occur simultaneously. They can exacerbate each other, increase hazard severity, but also the consequences, and compound and cascade into each other. And then, multi-hazard events aren't just natural hazards. You can have human-caused hazards as well. So the scenario that we assessed was interior drought and heat with a wildfire that then exacerbates subsequent atmospheric river floods and then debris flow, followed by a moderate earthquake on the West Coast. We've had a very similar scenario to this already, except for the earthquake. I think it's becoming quite common in BC that we'll have drought and then wildfire and then potentially flooding in the fall. So in many ways, this is, I hate to say it, but kind of our new normal. And so it's a way, the scenario is a way to help us think about what does that actually mean for our governance, our response capacity, our buildings, the people in them, and then what happens if we also add maybe an earthquake or another hazard onto that. Yeah, recognizing that this is the reality that we're living in, and just trying to think about what that means for our short and long-term planning. So the resources that actually came out of this big assessment, we have divided into a full technical report, which has literally everything, all the methodological details, all of the appendices, all the findings. This is where you go if you want every single little technical detail. We also have the Hazard Insights tool, which I'm going to give a demo of today. This is the results of the geospatial analysis. We have an executive summary, which includes summary tables and a bit of a higher level overview of the report. And then we also have a summary for policymakers, which is about 60 pages, I think, and is really intended to pull out key findings and be sort of an easy copy paste if you want to pull specific details over into your own work. And that's organized by hazard and value. And then last, we have a story map, which is intended to be a little bit more of a public level of information. And so tailored to folks that might not be experts in this space and just want to get some of the key takeaways. And that's on our website as well, which you can access at this nice QR code here. On the website Climate Ready BC, which some of you might already be aware of, that's our key resource website for most of the disaster and climate resources that we have out of EMCR. And includes a funding page as well, so that might be of interest to some folks. I want to just talk a little bit more about the Hazard Insights tool before I get into the demo. So again, this is the results of the quantitative analysis. And the Hazard Insights tool provides provincial scale layers for the 6 hazards that we looked at, and does include future climate projections for extreme heat, drought, and coastal floods specifically. And then it used existing data sets, but in some new ways for wildfire, earthquake, and riverine floods. So it did some new analysis on those data sets. And the Hazard Insights tool provides hazard exposure analysis, which I'll talk about a little bit more, So specifically linking hazards to things like populations, assets, and critical facilities with data and reports that are available for use. So hazard exposure analysis specifically is what? So when we think about risk and therefore resilience, we typically think about these three things. So exposure plus vulnerability plus where the hazard is actually going to be. The Hazard Insights tool looks specifically at exposure and then where the hazard is going to be. Right now, it doesn't look at vulnerability, though that is something we hope to add in the future. So at the moment, what it does is it essentially overlays where hazards are going to be, and then how that then intersects with different assets and populations. And so we can identify where different things are exposed to a specific hazard. Currently, the way that this is done is like a yes or no exposed. So when the exposure is above a certain level for each hazard, then it will say, yes, it's exposed. If it's below that level, then it will say, no, it is not exposed. And so this is helpful for doing what we would call something like a screening level assessment of broad areas. So it's not going to get down to say, this exact parcel is 100% exposed to a hazard. It's going to say, here are some broad trends of exposure. And if you're seeing an area that looks like it has a lot of exposure, then maybe do a more detailed analysis, or generally think about, okay, perhaps we should be planning for certain hazards. I think this will be easier when I actually pop the Hazard Insights tool up. So I'm going to get to that. And yeah, this is just a little bit about sort of from the back end, what it actually looks like to do a hazard exposure analysis. So basically we take different data sets, for example, a hazard, something like population and different assets like critical facilities, roads, parks, buildings. And then we overlay that with different points or lines or shapes to then quantify the exposure. And that gets summarized into a number. So we can sort of ballpark say that in a certain area, different things are exposed. For example, 5 critical facilities, 6 kilometers of road. And so we get this sort of rough calculation of trends. So yes, I'm going to demo the Hazard Insights tool, but maybe before that, I'm going to just change it up. I'm going to finish up with my next steps, and then we'll go to the Hazard Insights tool, and then I won't have to pop back into this presentation. So before I get into the demo, I just wanted to share a little bit about what the province is doing next and where we're going with this work. So what we're working on right now is guidance and tools for completing risk and resilience assessments. This is partly tied to requirements to do risk assessments under the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, and that's something Dave is going to talk about a little bit more. There are some new things in the legislation specific to risk assessments, for example, considering climate change, and considering intersectional disadvantage. And so we want to make sure that communities feel that they know what that actually means. We're also further developing the Hazard Insights tool, which you're going to see soon, with new hazards and new analysis. And that will include eventually moving to different levels of hazard exposure instead of just a one yes or no. We'll continue to build out that Climate Ready BC website with lots of different resources. And then also we're currently working on some updated regional climate projections at the watershed level with the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, so that we'll have a little bit more detailed information for climate at the regional level across BC. And then we also have some of our own risk and resilience assessments that we as the province are doing, specifically EMCR is starting work on assessments on tsunami, volcano, and extreme weather, which is both extreme heat and extreme cold. And then just generally thinking about how we can better address needs at a regional scale. So whether that's tools and data to support regional districts and local governments to do risk assessments, or maybe that's partnerships, building relationships with each other, with First Nations, with academia, whatever that looks like for folks to have the capacity and the tools to actually do this work better. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my deck, and I'm going to share the Hazard Insights tool. Okay, so I'm going to share my whole application here because I'm going to flip between a few different tabs. Okay, so you should see a web page that says the BC British Columbia Hazard Insights tool. If you do not, let me know. Okay, perfect. So this is the landing page for the Hazard Insights tool, also known as the HIT. So this is where you can start, and it has a little bit of context about the HIT and about exposure analysis. And then you scroll down to see the different hazards. And if you were to click on one of these hazards, which I have already done, then you'll get a page that looks like this. So this is the actual Hazard Insights tool. So just navigating a little bit on what you see here. So on the left-hand side in this banner, there's some different information here to help you get started and understand what data you're actually looking at. You can also go here if you want to generate a summary, and that produces a report of the information that you're seeing. There's a few other things there. I specifically clicked on riverine flood. So what we're seeing right now here is I live in the Capital Regional District, so that's what I've selected. And so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. So you'll see on the right-hand side over here, it's telling us that this is riverine flood exposure for the Capital Regional District. At the moment, the summaries that are being produced are at the regional district level. And in the future, we're hoping to also have summaries by First Nations language group, and then a few other ways to summarize the data. So what this is telling me right now, you'll see the grayed out area is the regional district, and the thatching is the actual hazard exposure itself. And it's saying that in the Capital Regional District, there's 4% of the population is exposed to a certain level of riverine flood. And then you can go into specific age groups. It's producing summaries for businesses, for different built form values. And there's a lot of different pages you can flip through to get different exposure summaries. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to give you a sense of the types of things that it is summarizing. And again, you can export all of this information into a report where it'll lay everything out in a linear fashion. If you're interested in learning more about what these things actually are, for example, fish and fish habitat locations, there's a little icon on the right here that you can click on, and then it will tell you the definition of what we call the asset, and then the definition of that asset, and then the data source, so where that's actually come from. And as you would have seen in the presentation, what's happening here in the back end is we've got the different data sources for all of these different assets, and those are being overlaid with the hazard extent data set. And again, it's yes or no, is the thing exposed? So again, very helpful for this kind of high level, granular, not so granular analysis. If you're interested in learning more about that threshold, the when is it in versus when is it out, you can click on this hazard information tool. And then this is getting into some quite technical detail, but if that's something that you want, then you can get into some of the actual technical details of what is the different hazard process, what are the assets that were assessed for each hazard, and then what are the actual thresholds. So for riverine flood, which is what we're currently looking at, the threshold is it is exposed when areas with potential riverine flood inundation for a 1 in 200 year flood. So that's when we're saying that it is exposed versus not exposed. So again, just helpful to give broad trends across the province. And in the future, we are going to build this out to have different tiers of exposure. So like a low, medium, high exposure instead of yes or no. So stay tuned for that. The last thing I will show in this demo, and then very happy to accept questions later, is that we do have future projections for a few hazards. Hopefully we'll have them for all hazards. That's something that we're working on. But for right now, we've got that for drought, for extreme heat, and for coastal flood. So I'm just going to click on coastal flood here and let it load. Pop up with a little disclaimer. Make sure that you know what you're doing. And then you're going to see a very similar layout to the other page we were on. But this allows you to actually compare current and future hazard extent. So we've got the same summary bar on the right-hand side. We've got the same navigation bar on the left-hand side. But when the middle loads, you will see how it is a little bit different. I'm going to zoom out. My GIS colleagues have fancy laptops, so this happens very quickly for them, but I just have a plain Jane ThinkPad. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. Okay, so you're seeing some hatching on the map. That is coastal flood exposure. And if you click on compare future hazard extent, it then moves into this where you've got the baseline, which is current as of today, and then you've got future. And what it allows you to do is to swipe back and forth between the two. And hopefully it'll load in a moment. And if it doesn't, I'll go show you some other things and then we'll come back to this. Okay, while this is syncing, I'm just going to show you, oh, here we go. Okay, so the baseline is in blue and the future is in red. And so on the map itself, you'll see that we've got baseline and then we've got future. So I'll start with the baseline being blue. And then you'll see if you swipe over, you can see how it changes. And you can look at different areas to see how it's going to change. Specifically, this one is for 2100 future comparison. And you can also see how the asset summaries themselves are also changing. So again, blue is current and red is future. So an example is a current total annual revenue impacted by coastal flood is 6%. And it's going to go up to 9% in the future. And then again, you can flip through these different assets to see how they may change in a future climate scenario. Okay, just a couple other things, and then I'm going to stop talking. So this web page is our Learn More for the Hazard Insights tool. I'm going to pop all these links into the chat when I'm done here. This has a really nice quick video to help you understand the Hazard Insights tool and how to navigate it. And then if you want to get into some of the technical details like the methodology, then we've got links to all those things here. And then just lots of different information on actually navigating the tool itself. So please do explore that. We've also got some definitions of things, frequently asked questions, etc. Yeah, just reminding folks you can download all of the data. So if you have your own platforms, Jessica, I think you're going to talk about doing this yourself. If you have your own platform and you want to download data and you want to add some of your own data, then you can do that. You can download the different data sets and the different layers, and then you can upload them into your own platforms and compare them with your own data. So if, for example, you want to use the same asset layers, but you have your own hazard extent layer, for example, then you can do that through the tool as well. And then this is the web page for the DCRA overall, and it's from here that you can then navigate into the Hazard Insights tool, as well as into all of those other resources I mentioned. So the full technical report, the summary document, the story map. I'll put links of all of these into the chat. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to pass it over now to my colleague, Dave, to talk about a little bit more about the risk assessment requirements under the Emergency and Disaster Management Act. And looking forward to questions and comments later in the webinar. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Much appreciated. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Aronian. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Community Partnerships team in the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions. And our group, we work specifically with communities across the province. We also run the local government climate action program. And for context, wow, about 5 years ago now, I actually worked at BC Housing for a year, which gave me a really good understanding of the issues and challenges faced, within the social housing sector. And the work that I did was working on essentially how do you embed resilience planning into the development of new buildings, and some of that work is certainly what I've built on is more the work I do now around risk assessment. So I'm going to share my screen here, and what I'm going to talk about just briefly for a couple minutes is the next steps building on what Melissa has talked about at a provincial level around the new requirements under the Provincial Emergency Disaster Management Act. So for some reason, my presentation is not showing up like it did before. Let me just try this.
It looks like you're sharing your Zoom screen there, Dave. Can you try opening up, if you minimize your web browser and then open up your PowerPoint?
I'll give that a try. How's that look?
We still just see Zoom, so we see you again.
That's a weird one. When we tested this worked just fine.
It did. That is okay.
Okay, hang on a sec. I'll try this again. I'm at a bit of a loss here because my PowerPoint is open on my screen and it's not showing up.
Dave, I've got your slides here. I can pop them up. You won't have your speaking notes, but I can put them up for you.
If you do, then let's do that so we don't waste time here.
There you go. Thanks, Jessica.
Are you seeing things here?
You haven't shared your screen yet, I don't think there. There you go. Now we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm not sure why that happened, but I may have made some tiny changes since I sent these, but that's fine. It's not a big deal. Okay,
Thanks,
so I'm just going to take a couple quick minutes here. Building on the provincial DCRA, one of the next steps has been to develop guidance for, in this case, local authorities, but it also applies to provincial ministries around meeting the new requirements under the Emergency Disaster Management Act, or EDMA. And essentially, effective January 1st, 2027, local authorities are required to begin preparing risk assessments, emergency management plans, and business continuity plans. And that this is a legislative requirement, so it's not something that's optional. And these requirements that I'm going to speak to apply to specifically municipalities and regional districts. Next, please. And what EDMA actually states for risk assessment, which is the part I'll speak to specifically here, is that risk assessments need to do two things. And much like the DCRA, really, you have to look at identifying hazards and assessing the risks. So identifying the hazards that could be, reasonably be expected to affect your area, and look at both natural hazards and human-caused hazards, and then to assess the risk of those hazards. Next, please. And for each hazard, the requirements are basically to look at the likelihood. So how probable will that hazard lead to an emergency? Or sorry, what's the probability of a hazard leading to emergency? The scale and scope. So how large, how many people could be affected, area, what type of infrastructure. Consequences for people and property. So people, buildings, roads, utilities, objects or sites of heritage value, evaluating those characteristics. And then importantly, disproportionate impacts. So individuals experiencing intersectional disadvantage, vulnerable individuals, animals, places, or things. How are they all affected? Next, please. And these risk assessments are required to be based upon things like studies and surveys, so work that has been done previously as well as new work. A key one is Indigenous and local knowledge. And one of the requirements of EDMA is to communicate and collaborate with both local Indigenous governing bodies or Indigenous communities, as well as other local communities in your direct area, sort of as required, depending upon scope and geography. There's also a requirement to include climate change. So including future climate and projections for future climate is a requirement. Legislation calls for other relevant info, as well as consultation results, and that refers back to consultation with the appropriate communities and various other groups that might be required here. And I'll just stress that the components around looking at impacts for vulnerable populations and working with Indigenous communities is definitely a new component, and that has not traditionally been done in risk assessments in the past to any large degree. So it's a new element to this work, and there are certainly a number of questions around this. Next, please. So the guidance we're developing, and when I say we, I mean my ministry, which is Energy and Climate Solutions, along with EMCR, where Melissa is essentially helping with information on what does this mean, like what has to actually be done. And so the guidance we're going to develop is going to basically talk about, who has to do this, so the who, what, and why. But really the meat of this is going to be, how do you do a risk assessment? What are the basic components that you have to do to meet the requirements of this new legislation? and also to address questions from local authorities. Over the last months, and even, I mean, more than a year now, because we know this has been coming, there have been a lot of questions from local authorities on what does this mean? How do you do this? Who does it apply to? Where's the data? Which data do we use? What are the climate projections we're supposed to use? There's a whole lot of things that we want to try and address in the guidance as well, so that when it takes effect on January 1st of next year, communities will have a good starting point and an understanding of what is actually required. Next, please. Two of the key things that I really want to just point out here is that the methodology to be used for risk assessment is essentially the same, with obviously scope differences, but whether you're at a provincial level, a community level, or in the case of housing at a project level, or a specific building level, it's still largely the same methodology you're using to identify hazards and assess the level of risk, to apply the future climate projections, and to identify vulnerable populations and so forth. So that's why I think this is relevant. And part of the work that, again, with this guidance that could be of interest for you folks is that really the methodological considerations that will provide certainly apply even at a specific project level. The other thing I wanted to mention, and Melissa talked a little bit about this when she mentioned sort of the multi-hazard scenarios, is that what we call cascading impacts are often the most significant things that affect people. So even at a specific project level or building level, you might be experiencing an extreme heat event, flooding, wildfire smokes, things like that. Those are the hazards that are actually happening. But in many ways, what is most important to the people in those areas are what we call the cascading impacts. Because of that flood, for example, you have to evacuate. So it's the evacuation. And how does that translate into both preparing for that and responding to that? Other things like, for example, what if transportation networks are cut off? What if supply chains are cut off? Those sorts of things. What if power is out, and for more than a short time? If there's no electricity for, let's say, more than 72 hours, even up to a week, what are the implications of that? So it's these cascading impacts that are really important to consider as part of your evaluating the risk, especially at a more local level, that is often more significant than sometimes than the hazard itself. And so that's something that we'll be providing, again, some guidance on, to making sure that those considerations are taken into account. Next, please. And just to finish up here quickly, this guidance is going to be complete prior to the regulation taking effect on January 1st, at least that's our plan. Our hope right now is that we have something we can actually present, hopefully perhaps at UBCM, the Union of BC Municipalities Conference in September. And part of this process is going to involve feedback from local governments to make sure it's meeting their needs and so forth. And we're hoping again that this is something that can be used by and not just by local governments. I mean, anyone can use this guidance as you're working through sort of how to do risk assessments. I believe that's the last slide that you have for me, Jessica. I added one in here just actually with my contact information, so I'll throw that in the chat, because I want to make it just clear that as we're working through this process, I'm always open to, if anyone has questions about this work, please ask away. More than happy to help. And also questions on what's important in this process will also help us making sure that the guidance we develop is relevant and useful. So maybe I'll stop there, and I think I'll pass this back to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Dave. I'm just gonna switch back to mine. Okay, are you seeing the slides on your end? Great. So I'm just going to do a brief section now before we open up for discussion. And it's intended as sort of a practical translation from the provincial context down to sort of the housing, often building and site level. Some organizations may already be doing this kind of work, and some are really just starting to think about it. So I'm really just trying to build a sort of practical starting point and understanding to build from. So Melissa and Dave obviously walked us through this high level provincial context and some of the emerging requirements at the local government level. And I want to focus in a bit more now from what this means from a housing provider perspective, because for a lot of organizations, the challenge is not simply, accessing hazard information, although this is still quite a challenge. It's understanding how these kinds of hazards and risks show up operationally. So, how do they affect your buildings, your tenants, staffing, emergency response, capital planning, and sort of day-to-day operations? And importantly, how we move from an awareness sort of into preparedness. At a broad scale across the province, conditions are really becoming wetter, windier, warmer, and more wildfire prone. For housing providers, these changes increasingly show up through operational impacts. So things like overheating in your buildings, smoke infiltration, different building systems, your mechanical systems being under pressure, more intense rainfall, meaning that your sort of building envelopes are much more vulnerable. Windstorms may mean exterior damage. And a lot of buildings were designed around historic climate assumptions that may not fully reflect sort of what future conditions will be. So, what could housing providers actually be looking for? One of the most important things is sort of recognizing how these hazards might show up across your housing operations. So, extreme heat doesn't become just a temperature issue, it's an overheating issue, a health issue, a question of do we need active cooling? Do we have portable air conditioners or fans for when heat waves do occur? From a wildfire perspective, wildfire smoke becomes an indoor air quality and filtration challenge. What kind of filters do we have on site? Do we have extra of them in the event of a wildfire? Heavy rainfall can show up as basement flooding, equipment impacts. So these climate risks really start to become, how does this operationally kind of manifest for housing providers? One thing we've increasingly learned is that resilience to climate and disaster hazards is not showing up through a single action. It's really happening across multiple levels within an organization, sort of simultaneously. So, at an organizational level, this includes your emergency response planning, communications, staffing arrangements. At a building or housing portfolio scale, organizations can begin identifying which assets may be more exposed or more vulnerable, and where to prioritize investments. And then, sort of, when we come down to a specific building or specific site, this then starts to translate into much more sort of practical impacts of filtration and cooling and backup power and so on. And I think importantly, these levels really reinforce each other. So, strong buildings without organizational preparedness can still create risks, and strong emergency plans without buildings that have resilient design features in them also, unfortunately, do create limitations. This is a bit of a simplified example of how one climate event can trigger broader housing and operational impacts. In this example, extended rainfall led to flooding that affected critical electrical systems and resulted in outages and tenant disruptions. So this very quickly moves from an issue of a building being flooded to one about emergency response, continuity, tenant support. It sort of highlights sort of this interplay between both your physical systems and then your organizational preparedness. Just touching a bit now also on what Dave raised about cascading impacts. This is just an example, sort of a simplified example of how one climate event like a flood can really create cascading impacts well beyond the initial damage itself. So what could be initially just flooding, very quickly turns into how do we immediately move tenants? Where do we relocate them to? What repairs need to be done? Does this housing need to be teared down? How do we pay for temporary housing? We now need to bring insurance in. And so these sort of cascading pieces really start building up over time. One of the messages I wanted to leave today is that climate and disaster resilience really often starts with asking sort of quite practical or simple questions. So, what hazards are affecting the areas our housing is in? Which of our systems within our building are vulnerable? Do we have tenants that might need additional support? How prepared are we from an organizational standpoint? And I think important here, you don't need sort of a full, sophisticated, technical, climate or disaster risk assessment completed before you can start having these kinds of conversations. So just one practical thing that providers can sort of start doing in terms of hazard identification for their buildings is to use provincial hazard data sets to build a broad understanding of where exposure may exist across their portfolio. So in this example, what I've done is taken that future drought hazard extent from the Hazards Insight tool that Melissa showed us earlier. It's the shaded area with sort of diagonal lines. Across it, and I've overlaid sort of hypothetical housing locations on top of it. And this very quickly starts creating a picture of which sites might be exposed to future drought conditions. This type of mapping can be done relatively easily. Open source tools like QGIS or even Google Maps can be used. One can download the provincial hazard data and start really saying where do our housing, where does our housing sit and how exposed could we be? Just to reiterate what Melissa did say, these data sets are screening level tools. They're not intended to tell you whether a specific building will or will not experience damage, and they don't replace engineering or site-specific analysis. But even at a broad level, this type of awareness can be very valuable for prioritization, for preparedness, for continuity planning, and to help you say, where can we start looking more closely? We've actually undertaken this exercise or this analysis ourselves at BC Housing, and it's helped sort of paint this broad awareness kind of picture of where exposure is sitting. And I know Emma is also starting this process of trying to understand where their exposure is lying based on these provincial data sets. Just looking at another tool at BC Housing, we've developed a climate risk assessment framework tool. It's an Excel-based tool, and it's helping us integrate climate risk into new development and building design decisions. So this framework really moves beyond just identifying hazards to asking questions like, what could the impacts be? How significant are they, and what actions may reduce risk? So it uses a fairly standard approach where risk equals likelihood times consequence. It combines climate information with sites and building characteristics and sort of helps us link risks to mitigation and design strategies. This slide shows the overall process of this Excel-based tool that we have, from indicating where your site is to then a risk assessment being undertaken and design responses being generated. Once this tool has sort of identified your risks, it then links those risks to practical design strategies. So, for example, a flood risk would maybe suggest a strategy such as elevate your mechanical rooms above your flood construction level. And this tool or tools like this start connecting, climate hazard exposure information into practical design decisions for non-experts within the housing sector. This is another example just of a tool that can be used for risk assessment at the building scale. It's a tool called Climate Insight, developed by ICLEI Canada. It's free, it's open source. You enter an address in, a project type in, and then the tool generates a hazard profile and a risk assessment alongside potential resilient design strategies. The team behind this tool is actually coming to a later session with ours to present on this, and we'll also ask housing providers to bring some examples of buildings they're struggling with, and sort of will help you walk through this. So just encourage you to look out for that session. Just the final message I want to leave is that resilience is really an ongoing process, and organizations don't need to address everything at once. Oftentimes, the best starting point is sort of simply understanding where your hazards, where your exposure, where your risks may exist, and strengthening preparedness and sort of gradually integrating climate considerations into maintenance, into retrofit, into capital planning processes over time. I think partnerships also matter a lot here. There's a lot of housing providers that are navigating similar challenges. We're very much navigating these challenges at BC Housing, and there's huge value in sort of collaborating across the sector. So we'll now move into sort of a discussion session. You can use the chat to unmute yourself and feel free to speak, or just sort of type in a response if you want. There's sort of three questions we have here for you all to kick things off. Please also feel free to sort of ask more general questions to Dave and Melissa on the topics they presented on. So just to go over these three questions, the first is we're really interested in hearing, what you're already seeing on the ground. Many of you are already dealing with this operationally, whether you formally call it a climate or disaster risk or not. We're also interested in sort of how events like the heat dome or the atmospheric river in 2021 have already shifted your thinking or the kind of approach you're taking to preparedness in your organization. And then lastly, from a practical perspective, what kind of support or tools or information would sort of help you move forward? Yep, so I open the floor up now, and please feel free to start popping some answers in or start asking some questions.
Carlo, I see your hand is up.
Yes. First and foremost, thank you for the presentations. They're really awesome to see, and to see that there's tools out there to help you with planning. My name is Carlo, and I work for AMA, and I'm a project manager. And I don't have very in-depth background in emergency management. Most of my experience is around asset management, and I'm sort of just drawing my experience from that. And we've developed a lot of strategies and plans and so on. But where I find typically where the gap is the implementations of those plans and strategies. And one gap or challenge is capacity, typically, to implement them. It's huge. Because in some ways, status quo, there's not even enough capacity to do what's needed to do at this point. So when you add all this on, it's typically done on the side of someone's desks, or you hire consultants and so on. However, though, I think to sort of help mitigate capacity issues is to assess the organization's maturity around emergency management. Maturity in terms of planning, maturity in terms of mitigating, responding, and lastly, recovering, right? Like I see those as the four buckets in emergency management. And I think if there's a tool to assess organizational maturity in emergency management in those four buckets, I think it would be really helpful for an organization to actually plan as they do this risk assessment to see what capacity they need in order to be successful in those buckets. And the other question I have too is service level. I mean, you can have a 5-star, I'm going to use the star rating, 5-star level resilient, right? Do you really need it to be a 5-star level resiliency, or like, does it need to be scaled to what's actually needed economically and capacity wise? And how do you do that? Like, what service level do you actually need to be resilient within your community? How do you determine that? So back to the question, and I don't know who this is questions towards to, is there like a maturity assessment tool that an organization can take to see where they're at and then assess where they need to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. Those are some really great points, and thanks for sharing. We really appreciate a lot of this happens off the side of the desk of pe folks who are really busy just trying to put out everyday fires in housing, and so there's a lot sort of on the side to deal with. We're grappling with that very question, sort of maturity levels and where one needs to head and where one should go from. So I, to be honest, don't have an immediate answer for you. It's certainly something we can look up and see. Is anyone else in the room have anything in mind that they would want to raise? Dave.
Um, One thing I can mention is that even though it's not a social housing context, here in my ministry, we're working on a project with a consultant to actually do exactly that, to build a couple of tools specifically for local authorities to help them with sort of the next steps. Like once you've done your risk assessment, you know what your risks are. How do you how do you move forward with that? And capacity is definitely one of the issues. But one of the things we're asking them to develop is quite literally uh, I forget what we're calling it, but it is essentially a how to assess your maturity tool to kind of sort of show where you at on this spectrum, and what does that mean in terms of how can we respond, and what works and what doesn't. So that's literally in the works right now, and so I've kind of made a note, and all you know the time frame for that's probably about 6 months from now, but I'll definitely circle back to this group with that, and share what we can. Because again, it's designed for local authorities, but I think it could be used by probably anyone. Um, so
That's
I hope that can be of some use.
Yeah, that's great to hear, Dave, because yeah, I think with all this stuff, it needs to be scalable, right? Because whatever capacity needs for Vancouver is not going to be the same capacity needs for like a northern community. And to having some tool that would sort of help inform those things would really help staff within a local level, regional district or municipality to really convey the message to their constituents, right? The board members. Because at the end of the day, they're going to have to ask for resources to implement these things.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave.
And Carlo, thanks for raising that point too about that the needs of different areas within the province, because we see that very much from sort of a building design level. Sometimes designers are all based in the Lower Mainland. They do not understand that in the interior, we're dealing with drought and wildfire. We cannot be we can't be putting wooden planter boxes in a wildfire-prone area. In a northern community that's much more remote, there's such a different response mechanism then to sort of emergency planning that needs to come up. And so I think tools are very useful in sort of teasing those differences out, because we otherwise sort of paint broad brushes and it's so different for different areas within the province. We really grapple with that at BC Housing as well. Is there anyone, I'm just sort of having a look at the chat here. Is there anyone else who wants to come in? Sarah?
Hi, just a question, maybe from Melissa, regarding the thresholds used for flooding. You stated you're using like a 1 in 200 year event, but as we know with climate change, those 1 in 200 year events are becoming much less than that. And I'm just wondering, in terms of why we chose that threshold, are we sure that that's like the the level of damage that can still, especially with like buildings and social housing that are already um, might have capital deferrals for new roofs, and they might already have existing vulnerabilities. I'm just wondering if there's been a lens there in terms of what threshold of risk from that kind of flooding event has been evaluated. And I looked at the future because obviously 1 in 200 is not 1 in 200 anymore.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah, and a really good flag. And I think a really good demonstration also of like both the opportunities and the limitations with this work. So the opportunity is that the 1 in 200 gives us some sense of places that are high risk. And even if 1 in 200 today isn't what it was in the past, it's definitely going to be more frequent today. It gives us like, again, that sort of baseline scoping, screening level understanding, and it's a starting point. It was all the thresholds were very long debated with people from like lots of different, like many of the different value areas. So thinking about what a meaningful threshold is for flood, for, you know, for people, but also for buildings, for critical infrastructure. So we landed on 1 in 200, and there's lots of documentation on that process as well that I'm happy to pop in the chat if you want to explore a little bit more. I think so. It's part of why we're hoping to move to a scale of thresholds instead of one like yes or no, just a single to think about high, medium, low, because that is definitely much more meaningful than just the in-out 1 in 200. So I think it's a really good point. At the end of the day, the intention for this geospatial tool was to start by getting that baseline screening level for the whole province. And so some very difficult choices had to be made about, you know, that does mean that we're not necessarily looking at what's most meaningful for a specific asset or a specific population or a specific area in the province. It was a choice that was made for something that's broadly applicable. And it also can change in the future. So this was done, I mean, this work actually concluded in 2024. So at this point, it's already like we're coming up on 2 years old and things are changing really quickly. And so the intention is to keep doing more analysis and to especially focus on that future climate piece. And then, yeah, to try and work on that threshold, the multi-threshold approach, to try and get into a little bit more meaningful exposure analysis across the province. Kind of a half answer for you.
I just mentioned it because I know there's been a lot of building the city of Vancouver during the heat dome, right? And even Metro Vancouver has done a lot of analysis, not necessarily the governments, but within the region there, of age of building and vulnerability to overheating. And it would be great to see that in terms of flooding as well. Because as I said, an ideal new building built today might be totally fine versus something built in the 70s where its roof needed to be replaced 10 years ago. And they're just been doing patch jobs. It's a totally different situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would love to see in the future, it would be great if we could do this as the province. If not, at least at like a regional district or local government or individual association level, is in cases like local governments have that more detailed vulnerability information. Like they might have done assessments of specific sites. They have mapped mitigation measures. And so what could happen if you wanted is that you could take basically what's in the hazard insights tool, the hazard exposure and the asset layers, and then overlay that with a local government's vulnerability mapping and their mitigation measure mapping. And then you can actually start getting a more meaningful understanding of risk. Because without the vulnerability, it's really just, it's very like back of the napkin, like here's where the hazards are going to be, here are where things that might be exposed. But yeah, like a new building, it might be totally fine. And so then you can start to sort of cross off, okay, that one's actually fine. We probably don't have to pay attention to that. Where are the ones that are more vulnerable, whether it's because they're older or they've got more vulnerable populations living there, or they're less vulnerable because there's a dike nearby. Like you can start to really get into some of that nuance, which you just haven't been able to do with this very sweeping level tool. So I would love to see the province go there. It does require, though, a lot of detailed data, which I do think local governments and other entities are actually, in many cases, more suitable for both collecting and also sharing. We have a lot of limitations at the provincial scale of the types of information that we're allowed to share. So that's something I think would be great to see for organizations to be doing. Again, use this as like your baseline and then add on the things that you have information for at that more detailed level.
Great, thanks.
Melissa, I think you addressed a lot of this in that answer, but there was just a question in the chat I'll read again for everyone to see if you want to add to. It says, how do you see housing providers translating this provincial exposure data into investment decisions, and especially when prioritizing limited funding for flood mitigation, emergency planning, or infrastructure upgrades?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically it, right? Is that this tool anyways, and it's not the only tool out there, but for this one, for the Hazard Insights tool, that exposure analysis, it's a great way to just like do that screening level. So identify, like if something isn't, if it's saying it's not exposed to 1 in 200 flood, then, and you've got really limited resources, then maybe we don't have to pay attention to that yet. Maybe we start on the ones where there is a higher exposure, and then, you know, maybe you can layer on that additional vulnerability data to just start to understand those like sweeping trends of where we should be paying more attention. It could also be that it'll identify, you know, an area, we might call it a hot spot of risk of hazard exposure, that you then can go and do a more detailed, like a mapping exercise or something like that. So it starts to kind of peel back the layers and start to zero in on areas to pay more attention to, and therefore to be able to prioritize those really limited funding dollars that we're all struggling with these days. So I think that's what it's really helpful to do. And I think too, the question or the comment, really great comment from Carlo about, you know, do you always need 5-star resilience? Maybe it's not always needed. I think it also helps with that perspective as well. So if you have money and, you know, you're able to do a bunch of different things in a bunch of different places, but one area has a lower risk, you still want to do something, maybe it doesn't need to be, you know, the best of the best building. Maybe 3-star resilience is sufficient for that location because the hazard exposure is a little bit less. So you can start to, you know, tailor the dollars you're putting in and the effort you're putting in a little bit more accurately to the exposure or the risk, and then just be a bit more strategic about the scale of work that you're doing, because I think, you know, we're going to be in this resource constrained environment for quite a long time, and that's a really important lens to bring.
Right, that's sort of how do we triage, how do we get really strategic about where we need to deploy and what's enough, right? Because this is such a tricky space to say what is enough, but we simply can't do everything. And this helps really say this is probably where attention needs to be paid.
Yeah, well put.
One thing I'll add there too is that, I mean, I'm hopeful that over the next several years, as communities, local authorities begin meeting their EDMA requirements, we're going to have a whole bunch of new information because, you know, new assessments are going to be done at the community level. And so I'm hoping that what comes out of that is, you know, slightly more detailed information. And over the next 4 or 5 years, I'm hoping that's what we'll have eventually, is a body of data that, you know, hopefully communities can share where, you know, where necessary as well.
Thank you, Dave. I see there's a question in the chat here that you did address, Melissa, and I might tag someone else in. It says, regarding the exposure data, curious to learn about how you are planning to assess the exposure of critical infrastructure businesses and buildings for extreme heat events. And I'm not sure there, Shreya, if you're sort of alluding to the fact that interior temperatures are sometimes different to your exterior temperatures. Feel free to unmute yourself, but otherwise, I don't know if Melissa or Dave, I know Magda is on the call as well, wants to come in sort of on the heat front.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can. Hi, Shreya.
So what I meant was when I went through the dashboard, like the insights tool, for like and about the how you did the exposure, like the parameters on which it was done, like the buildings or like infrastructure. So I didn't see except for like the population exposure, there was nothing done for heat, and I haven't also like seen it before anywhere else about that um asset part of extreme heat. Yes, there is the air conditioning or like retrofitting part of it, but it would be interesting to see how like other infrastructure, for example, like overloading of the electrical, like the infrastructure or like hydro. So, yeah, I'm just like, if you have any, I have never, I have not like come across any so far. So if I just wanted to know like what you're thinking about how to go about it. Yeah, just
Yeah, I'm happy to start and then really welcome, yeah, thoughts from Dave and Magda, who's an amazing expert as well. Um, so yes, you're totally right. For for each hazard, we've got a table. I can maybe just screenshot it and put it in the chat here, but that shows which assets were assessed for each hazard. And as you have noticed, not all assets were assessed for each hazard. And again, that's the relationship between the threshold that was chosen and its applicability for a given hazard. So in the case of extreme heat, the main asset that was assessed was population. And that's partly because the threshold that we chose aligns with the BC HARS threshold for 3-day extreme heat events. And that's quite focused on people and what heat does to people. And therefore, when it becomes serious and we need to pay attention, it's a little tough with critical infrastructure businesses and buildings because it can vary so much. So a specific business, like some businesses might do very well with the heat and others might not. Same with critical infrastructure, as you pointed out, Drea. Some CI will have a epic failure point at certain levels of heat, and other ones are going to be okay, or other ones might be okay now, but if it's exposed for a really long period of time, then it'll start to impact it. So again, because the intention of this tool is that sort of like provincial scale broad screening approach, the decision was made that we didn't have a good methodology to apply to different assets. As we start moving into this multi-threshold approach, like a low, medium, high, I do anticipate more assets might be able to be added into that, because then we can start to say, you know, like a bunch of buildings are typically okay at this level of heat, but then this one, they might not be so okay. So there's some nuance there that we might be able to get into when we do the multi-threshold analysis. But at this point in time, it's just so specific that it didn't feel helpful, and in fact can be a bit misleading to make sort of the sweeping statements that we're doing with the exposure tool as it is right now. But I'd really welcome thoughts from others on the call about methodologies that would be appropriate for this kind of assessment. I think there are ones that can do it, but it's very specific. It's like this specific building in this specific context. There are methodologies for that, but when we're talking about this like higher level, it's a little bit harder.
Thanks, Melissa. I see we've just hit time here, and I just want to close out the session. So just, yeah, a huge thank you to Melissa, to Dave, also to Courtney sort of for hosting and all the logistics. Thank you everyone for attending. Our next session is on the 18th of June and it will be on heat preparedness. And we really hope to see you all there. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.